Compared to earlier Zelda games, Breath of the Wild's dungeons are lacking. As unique as the concept is, the Divine Beasts pale in comparison to the maze-like dungeons with strong theming and tons of puzzles we used to get. Despite that, they're still enjoyable as their own thing, and it's about time I do a video on them. In this ranking, I'll be covering all 5 Divine Beasts, including the one from the Champion's Ballad DLC. The only dungeon not included will be Hyrule Castle. This is because it's not a Divine Beast, and therefore functions very different from every other dungeon in the game. This would make it difficult to compare for the purposes of ranking. Also, just like my other dungeon rankings, I will not be factoring bosses into the list, because they're a separate category to me. With that out of the way, this is FP Productions, and here's my ranking of the Divine Beasts from Breath of the Wild. A giant mechanical bird that soars over the Hebra Mountains, Vametto is certainly a visually impressive dungeon. I love looking out over the horizon whenever I play this part of the game, and it definitely leaves an impression. However, as a dungeon, Vametto really doesn't have much going on. Its main gimmick revolves around tilting its body, which causes objects to slide or gives you high ground to jump from. This is a fun mechanic, but with only 5 main puzzles to explore it with, it's over practically the moment it begins. Tilting the body slightly is also just underwhelming in general compared to what the other beasts have to offer. I've always found this to be the easiest and shortest Divine Beast, which is a shame, because if more was there, I could see this being one of my favorites. To be fair, its sub-freezing temperature does give it another challenge, but it's really easy to circumvent. All you have to do is buy the Snow Quill set and you're good to go. If you can't afford it, then a few spicy elixirs can also get the job done. Because of its lack of challenge and its short length even for a Divine Beast, Vametto sadly goes at the bottom of my list. Varuda was my first dungeon of the game, and I have to admit it did pose a challenge at the time. The water wheel puzzle had me stumped for a good hour or two, and it had been a long time since a dungeon had me clueless for that long. However, this wasn't so much because of the puzzle's cleverness, but instead my lack of knowledge on how Divine Beasts were supposed to work. I still wasn't quite used to Breath of the Wild's lack of hand-holding, so I thought the dungeon would prompt me when it was time to control the Divine Beast with my map. As soon as I realized that I had to use Ruda's trunk to spray water on the wheel, the rest of the dungeon was a total cakewalk. I expected its other puzzles to keep me challenged, but they basically just repeated the same concept in different ways. So aside from that one glorious aha moment, the dungeon wasn't too memorable. However, the way Ruda's trunk is implemented is clever, and I appreciate the dungeon's use of physics. Lowering Ruda's trunk to find treasure and then raising it up to jump to a higher part of the dungeon are pretty memorable moments as well. Still, some of the puzzles are barely puzzles at all, and involve basic uses of runes you've been using the entire game, and the dungeon feels lacking on repeat playthroughs. Varuda is a bit better than Vametto, but not enough to push it past number 4 on my list. When you first enter Varrudania, it's in total darkness. This disorienting lack of vision creates a real challenge even on repeat playthroughs. You rely on torches for sight, and each time you put one away to fight an enemy or happen to break it, you have to regain your bearings all over again. This tense push into the dark is a memorable start to the dungeon. Sadly, as soon as you get the dungeon map, the lights come back on, and the concept doesn't come back with new challenges at any point. However, its replacement gimmick is still pretty good. Like Meadow, it revolves around changing the beast's angle, but instead of just tilting slightly, you can turn it 90 degrees left or right. This completely changes the layout on a level close to Stone Tower Temple, and can actually be very confusing. Varrudania hasn't failed to make me scratch my head a bit any of the few times I've played this game, and that's the mark of a good dungeon. Of course, with only 5 main puzzles, it's still over pretty quick, but for a divine beast, it's really good. As the name implies, this DLC exclusive dungeon is the only one that can't be done in any order. To access it, you have to complete the other 4 and then undergo a series of trials. Thankfully, the reward at the end is a pretty robust divine beast, since being the definite last one means it can involve elements from all those before it. The beast is divided into a main room with 4 adjacent sections, and each of the 4 sections involves puzzles associated with a previous divine beast. Each of these sections on their own wouldn't be too impressive, but having all 4 in the same dungeon adds up to a satisfying end to your trials. Besides that, each section does at least have one pretty clever puzzle, and the dungeon truly tests your mastery of all the runes. The central room also has its own puzzles that sometimes have to be solved before you can enter the joining sections, making it more than just filler. The final trial feels pretty long compared to the previous dungeons and has a nice element of, well, finality, earning it the number 2 spot even though it doesn't even have a real name. Neborus is easily the most complex of the divine beasts, and comes the closest to truly feeling like a real Zelda dungeon. There are 2 gimmicks at work: connecting electrical currents and rotating individual sections of the beast's belly. These 2 mechanics create interesting puzzles on their own, and even better ones when working together. Many of the terminals can only be accessed once you've used electric currents to activate things blocking them, such as gates. Getting these currents to flow from point A to point B involves clever use of your runes, and usually takes some creative thinking. The rotating sections, on the other hand, create navigational challenges that make it tricky to move forward or get treasure chests. Simply crossing the room and getting to the right exit becomes a puzzle. Even better, the central sections have electrical currents themselves, and at one point you have to get them all aligned while still navigating across the room yourself, which ties both of the dungeon's gimmicks together in a satisfying way. Overall, Neborus always feels larger and more creative than the rest of the beasts on all my playthroughs, and leaves me much more satisfied. I really wish the others had been more on this level. Well, that concludes my Breath of the Wild Divine Beast ranking. If you want to see my other dungeon rankings, or Zelda rankings in general, check out the playlist you're hopefully seeing on screen. Also, I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments. This is FP Productions, and I'll see you next time.